Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. As you can see on screen, the big age question, which sensitivity is best? Everyone wants to know the answer to this, and the impact is actually huge in determining a lot of things, even the choices you decide to make in gameplay and your approach to aiming in general. For the purpose of this video, we will declare this as aiming behaviour, and before I answer this question I must first dissect a few areas to demonstrate. As mentioned in the intro to this series, this topic is huge, so there is a lot to mention and most of the things I'm going over will get incredibly complex in the sense that the reasoning will branch off into another area and the reasoning for that will yet again branch off into another area. So yeah, please do bear with what I'm saying because it will often lead on to more explanation. To start off, I want to show you how sensitivity can affect your approach to aiming, and it is general consensus at the moment that higher sensitivities are attributed to smoothness and tracking, whereas lower sensitivities are attributed to snappiness and flicking. I am in half agreement with this statement because what these sensitivity ranges actually do is help train your smoothness, tracking, snappiness and flicking. Not that they are inherently better for those skills. Once they have been mastered, you can exhibit them regardless of sensitivity, such as a low sense player that can track very well, or a high sense player that is extremely precise, and the result of how well you can exhibit these skills is summarized by your overall mouse control. Notably though in this characteristic, speed and precision are not mentioned, which is what we specifically look to train and improve on when it comes to aiming in general, in games or trainers, as well as learning different and new motions. So breaking down this characteristic, first I must show that lower sensitivity players tend to aim more predictively, and higher sensitivity players tend to aim more reactively. And this behaviour is exhibited with shooting kinetic targets and tracking targets. Let me show you a couple of examples and I will explain to you why this is the case. Let's take a precision-based kinetic task, RA head click. If we look at the distance required for a shot interaction from each sensitivity, we all know by default that it's more mouse movement for a lower sense player to make this shot. The difference is that when both mice start to move, the higher sensitivity player is already phenomenally closer to the target, so all they need to do is work up the rest of the distance. The lower sense player, however, has to continue a lot longer, and by the time they aim there, the target will have changed position. Therefore, what a lower sense player would normally do is read the position of the target and judge how long it would take for them to aim there, and as a countermeasure for being on a lower sensitivity, they will physically move a lot faster than the high sense player, and this fundamentally changes the approach because each player now reads and behaves to the situation completely differently. The lower sense player characterizes more of a static and predictive flicking type approach, whereas the higher sense player characterizes more of a smooth, leading up to the target type approach. Also, because the lower sensitivity player physically flicks faster, it is more difficult to determine where the aim is during the flick, or where the mouse position actually is on the mousepad at any given time, and this is where issues start to occur. I'll be going over speed and precision more in its own video though, and here, primarily, the focus is getting towards that final aim spot. When playing this task myself, I found I was flicking ahead of the target, waiting for the target to pass through and then just shoot it. The task itself trains click timing after all. I would then learn to land my aim closer to the target, and the end product just looks like anybody's average run, right? Which is why it's difficult to pick up on this. People playing on higher sensitivities than me, however, were leading up to the target and had a completely different approach. But the context of how each player gets here is super important, because the sensitivity now is dictating our approach behaviourally, and in turn, it's training different skills. However, before I move on to the tracking example, even though prediction and reading are good skills to have, I feel this is actually the wrong way to aim. You should always aim reactively in a moving target because you cannot account for the enemy's movement intention. If the target changes direction and you've already begun aiming, it will cause issues, because the predictive aim now lands your crosshair where the target would have been, and then you have to adjust, which costs time. The issue here is that it becomes increasingly more difficult to read your aim the faster you move it. You cannot know exactly mid-flick where your aim actually is, as mentioned before, though we can train it to considerable levels. Now let's relay the exact same issue into tracking, and I'm sure some of you have seen this before. Lower sensitivity players tend to focus smooth lines and predict the target's path to stay on, and they do this simply because they have to move so much distance. They're focused solely on covering the next chunk of distance while maintaining that tracking speed consistently. That is their focus. When the target changes direction, they predictively continue their line for another 200 or so milliseconds, and then what they do is flick back onto target. The problem here again, like I mentioned in the kinetic task, is that you're flicking so fast and then stopping in an effort to get back on target. It's made even worse that initially you continued to track because now your distance has increased for the flick, and the stimulus for that is to flick faster. The result though is that the player flicks fast and then adds tracking onto the end of the interaction predictively, and no focus is actually spent on the target's reactivity. So that, during the flick, if the target changes direction again, you see a lot of funny behaviour happening where the player completely loses the target and flicks desperately to get back on. Needless to say, the force that you flick to get back on target is now infinitely harder to counteract because it's in completely the opposite direction. Reactive players, however, are better at hugging the target during directional changes and keeping that gap small. Here it would be possible to branch off into smoothness and snappiness, which is what these approaches are now characterized as, but again that's for another video. So now that predictive and reactive behavioral examples have been covered, we can expand this into gameplay, and I'll use Valorant as an example. If we take a low sensitivity, say 100 centimeters 360, you wouldn't exactly dash into sight as a jet, and that's because it invites 360 aiming degree potential, which is subjectively more reactive aim behavior. The player knows it would take too long to aim at different places, and this is why they lean towards predictive aiming, and in turn, this starts to affect decisions made in game. It is often said by some players that they feel they have heightened confidence with higher sensitivities, and this is the exact reason why. Your subconscious is aware of your ability and you will start to make decisions out of things you feel able to pull off. In a slightly different way, a player on a higher sensitivity would still make the same decisions, but instead take a confidence hit if their precision is affected and they start missing shots. This overall perception of our ability often leads us to choose a range of plays we are comfortable for aiming with, and it becomes tough to branch out. This is likely why most of us are watching this video now, and leads us to experiment a lot with our sensitivity. We start aim training just to understand how we perform. However, we often fall into so many traps with this, and I will first mention the internal body clock, and if it's even good to change sensitivity before I go into that. The internal body clock is that we internalize and assign our own timings to interactions as a challenge for when we should complete them by. For example, this could be peeking an enemy. You know you would be dead in 1 second, or 0.8 seconds, so typically you try to get the job done as quickly as possible, or at least before you think that you'll get killed. So, at times, if you peek an enemy for say 400 milliseconds, if you miss your shots, players might feel inclined to take cover again because they interpret that situation as a failure from missing the shots, and it came close to that internalized time where they think they would die, so they went back into cover. It's also the reason why lower sensitivity players have to apply more speed in aiming to make up the time, like with the aim training examples shown previously. So in summary for this topic, this is why the generalization exists for predictive and reactive aim behavior, and why those sensitivities are deemed to be better at performing those interactions. As mentioned in the start of this topic though, if you exhibit these symptoms, then now you know why. But if you don't, then you'll have managed to handle your approach very well and train up all the skills as necessary and read the situations right. It isn't mandatory to change sensitivity if you are affected, but it can help you empty the glass and change your approach. This really helped for me, and I was playing low sensitivity for say 10 years plus, around 50 centimeters. When I changed to 30 centimeters, I felt like I was aiming in a slightly different way once I'd emptied the glass of this super fast flicking, and I went up 3 ranks immediately in the benchmarks for tracking and kinetic tasks. So this brings me on nicely to, is it good to change sensitivity? And as I just mentioned, I was on low sense for around 10 years plus. I would not change at all. I was adamant it was the best for precision, and now I understand that I was wrong. We will see across various resources that they say you should absolutely change your sensitivity, and that is true for aim training, yes. For gaming though, it becomes a little more complex because a part of the answer to that big question, which sensitivity is best, well, is actually dependent on what you're required to do. If you play a game where you have to 360 a lot, then by default a high sensitivity would be better, and a game that requires the smallest of movement, say like this, would be better suited to a low sensitivity. This is why I mentioned playmaking in my games before, because with whatever you are required to do, or whatever you want to do, you need to have the aim to support that. However, if you don't aim train, then I still believe you should change your sense in-game because there are so many advantages. For example, there is a reduced error margin on high sensitivities, so you'll learn to become more precise. You also learn to correct your aiming mistakes earlier, because if you aim at the wrong angle, you will be punished more. The problem that gets in the way with most players is the referential muscle memory. That is when they change sensitivity, then they aim how they would on their old sensitivity and miss shots. Then they'll quickly switch back and go through this routine for a long time without much change. That's because time is spent on adaptation instead of improvement. You just need to empty the cup and relearn. It's completely up to you whether you choose to stick on your low sensitivity in the long run if you feel it's best for the interactions in the game. The primary reason that I decided to budge after being stuck on low sensitivity for 10 years was that I actually felt like I'd peaked with my aiming. I literally did. I hit many personal bests and couldn't break them for months on end. I went down this same route of being frustrated, changing my sensitivity for a long time before I decided to stick to a higher one for around 2 months, and then bam, all new personal bests just like that. I also felt at the time when I went higher and then reduced, my older sensitivity had improved too, but it did spend some time adapting back into it again. It's often not a bad choice to just aim train at high sensitivities and continue gaming with your normal sense, but the important thing is picking up on how you're aiming and what you're doing so you can spot any improvement. The reason why changing sensitivity is a supported comment is because, as mentioned before, our overall mouse control governs our ability to do certain actions, and now I want to introduce incremental mouse movement. It's kind of similar to error margins. On higher sensitivities, any small change in mouse movement will see a considerable chunk of distance move on screen. In learning how to control this, they learn to be able to control that mouse at say 0.1 centimeter increments. If they need to move their mouse that much distance, they are able to. A lower sensitivity player may need to move their mouse at 0.4 centimeter increments to see the same on-screen distance, and so now you can understand that low sensitivity players are only able to move in these 0.4 centimeter increments. Fundamentally, when challenged with moving at finer increments, the lower sense player will struggle, and we can see these exact results from testing in Oblivity, the new aim trainer. A high sense player has consistent results throughout the sensitivities, but a low sense player could not operate on the higher sensitivities and dropped down. We can now look into why people say higher sensitivities offer higher skill ceilings, and that's because their level of control is absolutely phenomenal. They may not choose a high sensitivity when playing a certain game or task, but they could go much lower and absolutely just smash out a world record. I've tried to associate some rough centimeter 360 figures to their aiming preferences, but take this with a pinch of salt because any player can get good on either sensitivity and outperform another, so it isn't as blunt as saying this is better when skill is involved too. So for 50 centimeters, this is best suited for 45-degree aiming. 30 centimeters is best for 180-degree aiming, and I'm not sure about 360-degree aiming because I haven't crossed that bridge yet. Maybe when I am happy to shoot everything in front of me, well then I can look into sound detection and being able to aim behind me precisely and fast. Because our grips, aiming behaviors and sensitivities are all different, we're also all using different muscle groups. When you use low sensitivity in your setup, you start to deteriorate on the finer, minute motor functions of the exact same setup on a higher sensitivity, and that's because of the incremental mouse movement. It's adequate enough to sustain your motor abilities by occasionally training them. This is a natural thing and it happens often when we take breaks from things. If taking a month off aim training, for example, then sure your scores are bound to reduce, but that encompasses a lot of other factors too. I will follow up more on this during the grips video though, because here we can dig deeper into how much motor noise we're introducing into our aim style, with regards to whether we use our whole arm, just forearm and downwards, wrist and so forth. So I think I've just about summarised most of the important things regarding sensitivity and how much of a big deal it actually is. And moving back to the big question, I'm sure you understand now that the answer isn't as simple as just saying, oh my god, it's 43.2342, because it's specific to what you're required to do. I do, however, as much as it pains me because I know I've wasted so much time, want to say that if I could start over again, I would definitely have gone on a higher sensitivity and then learned some really good mouse control and then settled on a lower one if the game required it. If you're already quite average, say on 30 cm, it's possibly wise to go both lower and higher if that's all you've ever done. So yeah guys, I hope I helped clarify some things for you specifically if you notice you have a lack of an ability in a certain area, and it's potentially just because of how our aiming behaviours are built up. So for the next video I think I'm going to do translation because I've touched on behavioural approaches in this video and I think you'll be interested to learn about how we actually aim different between games as a tick in our nature. So when we load up Valorant for example, we could aim completely differently to how we aim when we load up Apex or even AimLab. I'll be starting on the production of this video this week. As I said, I want them to be quickfire, so I should be posting at the end. Thanks for watching guys, and as always, please leave any feedback below. Good or bad, I can take it. I want the content to improve for you guys, so just speak your mind. Thanks again, and I'll catch you in the next one.